Around 8 in the morning, on April 22, 2016, police in Pike County, in the southern U.S. state of Hawaii, received a disturbing call from someone on the other end of the line. She said there was blood everywhere, had difficulty breathing and was unable to provide any details. After a few minutes, she was able to explain what happened and said that she discovered that her brother-in-law and his cousin were seriously injured. Law enforcement officers immediately responded and arrived on the scene. However, a neighbor asked them to stop to give them 2 more addresses where the victims were located. His heart told him that they, too, had been attacked. Meanwhile, the woman found 2 more victims in another family home. By the time officers arrived at the 3 trailer homes, 7 people had died, all from gunshot wounds to the head, and another member of the same family was found dead at noon. The only survivors were a 3-year-old child, a 6-month-old baby and a 4-day-old baby. Baby Sophie, who was with her father, seemed to know that she would need to be protected that night. The Roden family came from a large family in Ohio, USA. Christopher Roden and Dana Roden were married in 2016 and had 3 children, Frankie, Hannah Mae and Christopher Jr. They lived on their property, which was located on Union Hill in rural Pike State. Christopher worked as a laborer in the Glee family compound and his 48-year-old cousin Harry lived with him in a trailer. Dana, then 37 years old, worked as a nurse's assistant at a youth rehabilitation center. She lived in a trailer 2 kilometers from her ex-husband with her younger children. The moment was 16 and 19 years old. They were mostly joined by Sophie, Hannah's 2-year-old daughter. Already 20-year-old Frankie arrived in a nearby trailer with his fiancée Hannah. He had a child from a previous relationship who was 3 years old and a child from a new partner who was 6 months old. Frankie spent most of his time helping his father around the compound. Soon after, Keen joined the family as Christopher's brother. Like the rest of his family, he was a hard-working guy who commuted to Columbus every day for work, and his home was only 15 minutes away from the rest of the family. The Radin family grew even more on April 18, 2016, when Hannah's new daughter was born, whose father is unknown. Hannah had a strained relationship with Sophie's father, Jake Wagner, so she had no desire to learn more. Hannah planned to raise her 2 little girls while working as a nurse's aide and finishing education. The relationship in the family was so strong that they even accepted Dana's sister Bobby Jo Manley into the family, who was unemployed. Hannah believed that all the worries of a newborn should remain in the family. The farm on which they lived was quite extensive, so Christopher entrusted her with looking after the animals. Bobby agreed without realizing that during one of these visits the most terrible meeting awaited her. On April 22, 2016 at 7:53, Bobby, as always, approached the trailer and immediately saw that the house was not empty. Christopher and Harry were lying in a large pool of blood. The woman burst into tears, took out her cell phone, dialed the emergency number and asked them to come to 77 Union. Then, almost instinctively, Bobby went to the houses of her other relatives, knocked on the doors but no one answered. A few seconds later, Frankie's 3-year-old son came out of the house. A frightened woman entered and was shocked to see the corpses of Frankie and his wife next to them on the bed. The 6-month-old child was still alive but covered in blood splatters. The family's neighbor stopped the officers as they were being transported to the scene. The bodies of Dana, Christopher Jr., and Hannah were discovered by officers in a 3rd home. They were both covered in blood. Radin advised them to go to 2 more nearby places as there were probably more dead there. The tiny child, who had only lived a few days when news broke, was the only survivor in the house. Mrs. Donald Stone, a cousin of the Ron family, rushed to make sure that no one was safe, but he, too, was wounded by gunfire. Little Sophie, who was in the house of her father Jake, also managed to survive after the killers did not touch her. After analyzing the bodies, detectives were able to piece together the crime. Donald called the police and reported that by 1400 hours they had found the last body. The victims were Christopher, Dana, Frankie, Con Gayline. They concluded that Christopher was awake when the killers broke into his home due to a defensive wound on his right arm. When he confronted the attackers, he was shot 5 times and 9 bullets struck the burned area. Dana also suffered multiple gunshot wounds to the head and neck. Some victims were shot even after death, indicating that the perpetrators were enraged. Like Frank, Christopher Jr. had 4 gunshot wounds to the head. Skull Khan was also shot 3 times. The only person who was shot once was Kenneth. Several shots from close range in an instant led to the death of all victims, the same bodily component. According to detectives, the killer fired 32 shots in total. No sounds were detected nearby, suggesting that a muffler was used. Also, everyone had various injuries and plastic bags on their hands. At least one of the victims had 9 serious wounds that were hidden during the cover-up. Although it was clear that the entire family was the target of the planned crime, investigators were baffled as to who could have committed such a horrific act. During a search of the house, police found 5 different varieties of helis from rented cartridges. But they also found another unfired bullet of a different type, which confirmed their suspicions that the crime involved several assailants, not just one. Investigators attempted to view surveillance footage from the homes, but the devices were turned off. Despite the fact that the blood of the victims was found in each trailer, none of them contained the DNA of the criminals. Moreover, no DNA was found, which indicates a clear and careful planning of the crime. The cops discovered something after hope was already lost. Marijuana plantations were found in 3 of the 4 houses. There were over 200 plants in one area. It was easy to conclude that the Rons were involved in drug trafficking since this was most likely the motive for the crime. Detectives looked into the possibility of a family dispute over drug money, but were unable to find anything. They also found cages containing fighting cocks in one of the 4 trailers. Retaliation officers also looked into whether the family had any ties to drug dealers or cartels. But as it turned out, the cause of the incident was not illegal cockfighting either. Dana's father told detectives that if the killers had not known the family, the dogs would have attacked them. This, coupled with the fact that there were no signs of forced entry in any of the houses, narrowed the case and proved that the killers were still at large and armed. The detectives were about to leave without finding anything when Leonard Manley's main witness appeared. To move the Radin family to safety, they searched for surviving relatives. 30 detectives combed every home and road in the state, interviewing friends and acquaintances of the family, trying to piece together what happened. As a result, there was such confusion and panic in Pike County that a businessman named Jeff Roby offered the sum of $25,000, who will provide information that will help the police in January 2017. The initial result of the investigation seemed to be only a contributing factor. Months have passed since the cartel attack. Police have interviewed 550 people, collected 1,100 statements, and examined hundreds of pieces of evidence but have been unable to determine a motive. A close relative of Rodinsky's raised relatives was of no importance. Authorities were forced to report the disappointing news on April 13, 2017. They stated in the media that they do not have sufficient evidence to make an arrest. Prosecutor Rob Young noted that they are still working on some leads that are not in the public domain. A few days after the incident, a year had passed. All the officials involved in the terrible acts were present at a short burial ceremony en masse. Local residents were still interested in the reprisal of the Rodansky family. However, neither the local press nor the sheriff or prosecutor showed up for the second mass, creating the impression that the largest criminal investigation in the county's history would go unnoticed. This continued until important information was received in June. At this point, the prosecutor's statements were justified, and for the first time he publicly expressed interest in the family, although they all lived 25 kilometers from the scene of the incident. The problem was that by that time the Wagners had moved to Kenai, a small town in Alaska, and took little Sophie, who after Hannah's death remained under the care of her father. Their love for Rodan served as an excuse for their departure from the state, but they did not have to wait long for their appearance. Jake Wagner and Hannah Radin met at school when he was 18 and she was 13. They went to prom together and were inseparable from then on. This also brought the two families closer together, and when Hannah was 15 they began holding meetings and parties together. Eventually they ran out of money and had to return to Ohio to prepare for arrest, and thus the relationship between the two families ended in bloodshed. Jake was her first child, conceived shortly after Sophie was born. The man invited her to move in with him and his family because he believed it would provide her daughter with a healthier upbringing. Hannah didn't agree because she thought it was an attempt to dominate her, and after that things went from bad to worse. Each family was fighting for their own interests, and both want full custody of the child. When Hannah refused to sign the custody document for him and his brother, Jake came to furious and threatened to take Sophie by force. He wrote to Khan expressing this intention. Once Jake reached this point, Jake also tried to control her by hinting that she should live with him if she truly loved her child. This also led the guy to think that the Radins could harm the girl. For 2 years, these negotiations continued, Since Jake was too nasty, Hannah decided to end their relationship in March 2015. In one of the messages, she said that she was tired of him pestering her and that he had hurt her. In the family, such acts of violence were not uncommon. Wagner used weapons to threaten the armed forces, and the situation became even worse when Khan announced that she was expecting a second daughter. Although she denied that she was the father, Jake was not completely sure about this since they had just had sexual relations. When Angela Wagner hacked Hannah's social media accounts in December 2015, she saw something that really angered the family. Weeks before this incident, Wagner tried to convince Hannah to give Jake full custody of Sophie again, but Hannah refused. Rita Newcomb, Jake's maternal grandmother, then forged documents to make this happen. In the midst of the trial, George II and Christopher entered into a bitter dispute over where their granddaughter would be, and relations between the two families had already completely deteriorated. The girl corresponded with her ex-partner and said that her ex-partner's family will have to kill her to gain custody of their daughter. The Wagers then began to prepare the crime for Christmas 2016. After a vote, it was decided that they would kill the Radin family in order to gain custody of Sophie. Over the course of 8 months, the murder was planned, and they carefully studied the Rodino family's daily routine, work schedule, sleep schedule, and home environment. They carefully examined the surveillance cameras and even drove past the Radin family's house to record the broadcast and determine the range of the noise from the shots. George III decided that it would be wiser to purchase components to make homemade silencers, realizing that the sound could give them away. For her husband and children, Angela bought shoes that they had to wear on the day of the crime before throwing them away. She also bought a communications jammer so that they could secretly connect them to the victims' phones. Was carried out to prevent them from receiving help. George II made sure that they were given a car that night so that no one could identify them. It was his turn that day, and Sophie was there on the night of the tragedy. While George II visited Christopher's house to convince him to join the alleged drug trade, Angela stayed at home with her girlfriend. Not realizing the consequences, he agreed to let authorities into his home. They discovered that Angela had bought sneakers a few weeks before the murder. These shoes matched the trace of a bloody sole found on the floor of one of the trailers, and also established that she had gained access to the account of her ex-daughter-in-law. Having studied the electronic devices of the Wagnerites, they discovered messages on the internet regarding parental care, obsession with control over children. The spies were sure that Jake was the mastermind of the murders and that all members of the Wagner family took part in them. Although Angela was undoubtedly behind this scheme, authorities reported the arrest of 6 people on November 13, 2018. So all that remained was to wait for the 2019 trial. The remaining members of Vagra remained in prison, refusing to help in the investigation and even declaring that they wanted to see the real killers. Rita Newcomb was able to hand over a handwritten agreement admitting guilt to avoid prison. Jake admitted to killing 5 of the 8 victims and pleaded guilty to criminal charges, 8 of which were aggravated murder, and the remaining charges of conspiracy, robbery, tampering with evidence, and unlawful sexual conduct with a minor. It seemed that the case would never be closed, and the residents of Agai would never again be able to sleep peacefully until 2 years later, on April 22, 2021, on the 5th anniversary of the massacre. Something unexpected happened. In court, he stated that he felt obligated to kill Hannah in order to defeat her and gain custody of his daughter. Although he expressed great regret, he knew that if he did not do the same to the rest of the Rodina, they would suffer retribution. After cooperating with prosecutors in cases against his parents and brother, Jake was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole after trial. This collaboration resulted in the discovery of 3 firearms that the family tried to smash and burn, as well as a van that George III had bought specifically for attack. They were hidden behind a pond and buried in buckets of cement. The Wagnerist houses matched those found in Rodin's homes, and evidence was fabricated. In return, she agreed to testify against the other accused. The prosecutor's office did not charge her with murder. Angela received a 30-year prison sentence. The trial of Friedrich George Wagner began on August 28, 2022. The prosecution alleged that he was an accomplice in the planning and cover-up of the murders but denied knowledge of the crimes committed before and after the murder. He went so far as to say that he would never comply if his family asked him to take part in such a case. 3 months later, George I was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. He continues to maintain his innocence while awaiting trial, which is scheduled for February 2024. If he is found guilty of the same 22 crimes, his son will suffer the same fate. The family as a whole was predestined. The care of distant relatives was entrusted to the surviving children. Although their whereabouts are kept secret for reasons of confidentiality, it is known that they are happy and safe. The intention of the Wagnerians was to provide her with the best care. But in reality they took away her own mother, aunts, and uncles. All that can be expected is that she will grow up separately from her father's family and in an environment where the use of violence to solve problems is unacceptable. Friends, write your opinion in the comments, and also subscribe to the channel and watch my other videos. Thank you all.